Do you think there can be some help with these lights immediately above me? It'd be better if people couldn't see me. And at the moment, I can't see anybody. That's lovely. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. And good morning. That's the best you can do. Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for inviting me to share in this particular conference. I'll let you into a state secret. It was, many months ago that I was invited to share in this conference as part of a tour that I'm doing in your country, and I refused the invitation. Tim Cantrell persisted that I should accept, and we had a long, anguished series of emails in which I kept on saying, look, I don't believe there's anything that I could contribute to a conference at which Gary Gilly and James White are speaking, and I would just be a spare part, so please deliver me from that obligation and let me not come. But he's very persuasive, plus he's bigger than me, and eventually he won out, and I'm here. So if at the end of the day you say, I wish he hadn't won out, then please blame him and not me. But Gary, that was a very generous introduction. It sure beats someone. I was speaking at a conference in England not so very long ago, and I was a little late because of traffic. And when I got in, the conference was already, it was a convention service, just one service, and it was already on the way, and the chairman was introducing a hymn. He finished introducing the hymn, and I'd slipped into the front row. And then he said, and I'll give you every word he said from then onwards. He said, well, now I only have one other obligation this evening, and that is to introduce our speaker. I've never heard him, but here he is. And sat down. I mean, a name would have been useful. He said nothing except, I've never heard him, but here he is. And some of you have never heard me either, the fortunate ones, but there we are. And what a wonderful title for a conference. And Tim and I agreed that I would speak this morning on the subtitle, I guess you have it in your programs, called Can We Be Good Without God? This will stretch you this morning as it will stretch me, but that's why I'm glad I'm the opening batsman here, when everybody is still reasonably awake, and some are almost awake. You've almost got there, and at least if we do this, it's going to be a tough session, I think, in this first session, then hopefully we'll be off and running. Now, what do you make of the title? Can we be good without God? If you think it means, do I need God's help in order to live a life that's pleasing to Him, then you must be very poorly taught. And I'm sure that's not what you think. A person who becomes a Christian soon discovers that without God constantly helping them, there is nothing that they can do, think, say, or be that is truly righteous and godly. In fact, there's good news and bad news in this area. The first is that at the height of his ministry, we find the Apostle Paul saying in Romans 7, I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature. I have a desire to do what is right, but I cannot carry it out, unquote. I could nearly take you to the spot on the ground when I heard a conference speaker using that phrase, quoting that scripture. I'd heard it many times before, and it suddenly dawned upon me. That's it. Nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature. My sinful nature is utterly unchanged from the time I was converted, and I'm still capable of sinning in ways that I'd never dreamt of sinning before. There's a lovely story of a girl who was converted and seemed to be making great progress, and her pastor gently indicated to her that she ought to consider baptism. And the day was fixed, and then she kind of pulled out of it because she wasn't having a very good time as a Christian, just going through a bad patch just before the time of her baptismal service. However, eventually she recovered from that and was baptized with great rejoicing. And then a little bit later, she came to her pastor and said, look, I need some help. I need some counsel. Things are going really, really poorly with me. And I really thought that all of that would end when I was baptized. And the pastor said, no, I didn't hold you under long enough. Now, there is a normative post-conversion Christian experience that will put an end to struggling against sin. It's called death. And most of us would like to have postponed for a little longer. The good news is, and Peter gives it to us, God's divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of him who's called us by his own glory and goodness. The Christian has access moment by moment, day by day, hour by hour, to all the power of God that would enable him to live up to the moral principles that God has laid down. So, I don't know what you made of the title, Can We Be Good Without God? But the meaning is very different. The meaning is this: unless God exists, how can we even speak about being good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair, just or unjust? Do good and bad make any sense unless the God of the Bible dominates our worldview? And worldview is a big name in our conference today. Let me give you a note on worldview. Philosophers like to use the German word Weltanschauung, but most of us don't speak German, so that doesn't help us very much. But if you've never heard of the word Weltanschauung, I've got news for you. You've got one. You've got a world view. And in the plainest Anglo-Saxon that I know, your world view is how you view the world. Well, that's not too difficult. At least I'm qualified for this part of the conference. I got that bit absolutely right. I was in Oklahoma at one time on a brilliantly bright sunny day, and I believe I was going out to play golf. I was being dragged kicking and screaming to a golf course, and I didn't have my sunglasses with me. So the pastor said, someone in the church runs an optician shop, we'll go in and get a pair there. So I went in, showed me all sorts of sunglasses, and here was a pair with a kind of greenish tinge. He said, take them outside and see what you think. Well, the sky was sort of slightly tinged in green, all the cars were green, all the people were green, the ground was green-ish, and I thought, well, I don't like the glasses anyway. So I went in, he said, well, try these. And they had a sort of light brownish tinge to them. So the blue sky was slightly tinged in brown, and the cars were all brown, and the people were brown, and eventually I chose a pair of sunglasses, and away we went. The point is this: everything I looked at was colored by what I'd put on before I began to look. And that's what a worldview is. It's something you put on before you look at anything else. Your worldview is what you assume to be true before you consider anything else to be true. It's what you put on before you look at anything, at history, at the natural world, at other people, and at how you treat them. And here's something else. Stephen Jay Gould, who is an evolutionist and an unbeliever, says this: every one of us must reach some decisions about the rules we will follow in conducting our own lives. Notice what he's saying. Your worldview determines your behavior. In other words, your whole approach to ethics and morals will depend on your worldview. What is it that you put on before you look at the world outside? Ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, meaning a foundation or a character or a nature. Ethics sets the standard and establishes why one kind of behavior is better than another. Morals, another Greek word, mores, is manners or customs, and it refers to people's behavior. So ethics tells us what ought to be done, and morals tells us what is being done. Now, just one more thing, and the meaning of the title at least will be clear, so we will have got that far. While worldviews have many different names, we can actually divide them, and we certainly will for our purposes today, into two. There is a biblical worldview, and there is a non-biblical worldview. Now, the non-biblical worldviews, and there are varieties of them, include secularism, humanism, pragmatism, existentialism, postmodernism, and aren't you glad I'm not going to stop to explain any of those? And there's no need to in a conference like this, I imagine, at least for many people. It would be no exaggeration, on the other hand, to say that a biblical worldview is crystallized in the first 10 words in Scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, once you have that in place, you have established the basis for a biblical world view. So back to the title. Can our world view make any sense at all of morals and ethics unless God exists? Let me introduce you to a gentleman called Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T, one of the most influential philosophers in modern history. In the 18th century, he taught that the God of the Bible was beyond our reach, which I find ironic because his first name was Emmanuel, God with us. And that's what he taught. He said that all knowledge was divided into, could be given one of two labels. The first was phenomenal, and the second was noumenal. And Kant said this, that the phenomenal embraced everything that we recognize with our five senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. That noumenal was where God was. God was in the noumenal world. In other words, beyond our knowledge. Kant's fingerprints are all over the modern idea that science deals with facts, but religion is a matter of faith at best and speculation at worst. But Immanuel Kant said that there was something that demanded some sort of God. He called it a categorical imperative, a sense of oughtness. He said we've got he didn't use these words, this is what he meant. There's an inner moral law that we have, and we can't seem to be able to get rid of it. His most famous saying was carved on his tombstone. Let me read it to you. Two things fill my mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe, the more often and the more intensely the reflection dwells on them: the starry heavens above and the moral law within. So even Kant said, we can't do without God. Although his idea of God, by the way, was a supreme being and a long way short of the God of Scripture. But even Kant saw there can be no basis for morality, no way of defining it. In another of his famous phrases, he said this: we must live as though there were a God. You follow me? Kant made easy at 8:30 in the morning. Where do we fit into Kant's world? Here's a popular scientist, Jakob Bronowski. He said that men were nothing more than, I quote, a machinery of atoms, unquote. Now that's pretty standard stuff for atheists, but all the available evidence is against it. There are many ways in which human life is radically different, totally different, not only from the material world, but even from all other forms of life on earth. And here are 7 off the top of my head. Firstly, we have vastly superior intelligence. Secondly, we are historical beings. We can evaluate the past. We can review the present. We can contemplate the future. We have self-awareness. We have a deep-rooted instinct that we're more than atomic accidents. We use propositional language. We're capable of complex reasoning and lateral thinking. We have mathematical skills. We have an aesthetic dimension. We can speak of things being beautiful and ugly and so forth. So these things mark us out from all other animals. Allow me to give a golfing illustration, much as it hurts me. My colleague Howard Williams and I were playing golf in South Wales a little while ago, a place called Langland Bay. And as we reached the end of the round, we were overlooking the gorgeous little village of Langland Bay, sitting there on the south coast of the Gower Peninsula. And as we did, the most perfect rainbow you've ever seen in your life appeared, framed the bay. Now, it takes a lot of things for golfers to put their clubs down, get their cell phones out, and take pictures. But that's exactly what happened. We were, can I use a modern phrase? I don't know what the original Greek is, gobsmacked at seeing this picture of this rainbow. And you know something? There were some cows in the fields there. Not one of them batted a bovine eyelid. They just went on munching away. I was in a game park 48 hours ago and just staggered at the beauty of the sunset. It was yellow, and then it was orange, and then it was brilliant, brilliant, brilliant red. Not an elephant moved a muscle. Well, they've got other things to do. Elephants have to eat 40% of their body weight every day. Did you know that? I could give you a lot more information about a game park right now, but that would ruin the whole conference. And it was bad enough to think of what they did with 40% of their own body weight every day, but we won't go there. Oh, and here's something else that differentiates us from the animals. We have a moral dimension. a stubborn sense that there's a difference between right and wrong, good and bad. Nobody who's thinking straight seriously denies that there's a radical difference between good and bad, right and wrong. Over 2,000 years ago, the Roman statesman Cicero said this: only a madman could maintain that the distinction between the honorable and the dishonorable, between virtue and vice, is a matter of opinion and not of nature. And he was right. A moral dimension seems to be part of our psychological software. Now, the interpretation of what's right and wrong may differ from society to society and from person to person, but there has always been a remarkable similarity in fundamental moral values. In 1948, the United Nations drew up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There were 31 articles listing fundamental minimum rights for every human being. It said things such as human life and liberty and dignity and security were morally good, and the things like racism and slavery and torture were morally bad. Now, that doesn't fit into Bronowski's idea that we're just a machinery of atoms. Well, my computer's a machinery of atoms, but it doesn't have any moral values. My computer can tell me nothing about right and wrong and justice and injustice. And the dumb thing can't even spell very well at times. And my iPad is infected with the same disease. And my friend Howard Williams would tell me that I could be in the middle of a place that offers free Wi-Fi, a restaurant or something or other, and everybody is startled to hear me in a corner sitting, "Oh, shut up, you stupid thing." And that's how I address my iPad. We have a conscience. Why do we become aware of moral issues? This insistent inner voice telling us to do certain things and not to do others. It pokes its nose into every part of life: business, family, the use of time and money, our relationships with others. It even, and forgive a third illustration already, it even intrudes on the golf course. The very first time I played golf, I played it all on my own, which is just as well. And I'd be out there and my ball would land in the rough and I would try to move it and, accidentally moved it half an inch. Went down. That's another shot. That's another shot. Nobody was looking. I wasn't playing in the Ryder Cup. I was like the Americans. They don't play in the Ryder Cup either. And but I jotted it down. And I could show you my first round of golf. 134. Well, nobody was counting except me. Why was I counting? Nobody was looking. Nobody else knew, but the conscience said, you hit that ball. And so you put that shot down. Conscience doesn't merely tell us there's a standard and then say, do what you like about it. It tells us what we ought to do. It tells us we should toe the line. A story is told of a man who kept cheating on his income tax return, and eventually it just got to him so badly that he wrote a letter to the tax authorities, put some money in it, in cash, and dropped it in their letterbox. And what it essentially said was this: look, I think for some years now, I've not been declaring things on my tax return, and my conscience is getting it. I just can't sleep at night. And so here is some back money that I really owe you. P.S. If I still can't sleep, I'll send you the rest. So we have this inner ought, and that ought to give us a clue about our worldview, because the word ought is based on Old English, meaning to owe. That is, we owe something, not instinct or feeling or desire. It imposes an obligation. The famous cellist Mstislav Rostropovich, interviewed for the Daily Telegraph in London, said, "Now that I've come to 75 years of age, I think what is most important in life is your conscience." And even those whose worldview says there are no universally binding moral obligations do, in fact, accept this, that nobody should deny his or her conscience. Now, isn't that remarkable? No government ever laid it down. No focus group suggested it. No inquiry recommended. No opinion poll ever decided it. And yet atheists, agnostics, skeptics, humanists, and everybody else in between accept that the human conscience has absolute authority. To obey it is right, and to disobey it is wrong. Writing in 2001 about the situation then in Afghanistan, nothing to do with the present one, An English newspaper journalist, Janet Daly, said this, and I quote, "There is an absolute moral duty to alleviate poverty and starvation," unquote. Now, she was not writing from a religious standpoint, and yet what she said was there is an absolute moral duty. She was not saying this is what we choose to do, this is what we could do, this is what we might do, this might be a good idea. Listen to her again. Without a religious context, we have an absolute moral duty. Now, what I want to know is, why do we have a duty to help people in Afghanistan? And why is it a moral duty? And how can it be an absolute moral duty? Where does this strange, powerful, universal, inescapable authority come from? Now, there are only four possibilities. And the first is that it comes from beneath us, that is, from nature. And that's the line taken by materialists and those who believe in godless evolution. The philosopher Michael Roos, for example, and the sociobiologist Edward Wilson together wrote this book. And in it they say morality, or more strictly our belief in morality, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. Ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes. Peter Atkins, who used to lecture in physical chemistry at Oxford University, said in a debate, "We must find the origin of the way we behave, and therefore our judgment about what is good and what is wrong, in the fact that we have found a way of surviving." So the only reason we do things that we think are good is because they help us to survive. How can we answer that? Well, here's some pretty basic questions. If the universe is nothing more than matter, energy, time, and chance, how can words like right and wrong have any kind of meaning? How do we get personal morality from impersonal universes? Matter doesn't have moral standards. How can we jump from atoms to ethics and from molecules to morality? At what stage in the millions, billions of years of evolution do atoms suddenly say, I don't think that's the right thing to do? Secondly, how can the natural world hold us responsible for our behavior? Take the law of gravity. Now, we are all subject to the law of gravity, but none of us has a moral obligation to it. On the other hand, a moral law tells us there are things we ought to do and things we ought not to do. We can owe morally only to something personal. How can we owe obedience to an asteroid or a mountain or the theory of evolution? Thirdly, how can we make a personal and moral approach to impersonal objects? Can we make or break promises to a tree or a teapot? Well, of course we can't. So it doesn't come from there. Notice how Richard Dawkins deals with morality. I'm sure you've heard of Richard Dawkins. He is, and I must quote this accurately, he is the world's best known and most highly respected atheist, unquote. That was said by Richard Dawkins. So we know he's... interviewed in the Daily Telegraph, he claimed to have, and I quote, "an ordinary citizen's view of goodness," unquote. And again, "I have all the right emotions against injustice. I do have a strongly developed sense of good. But as a biologist, I haven't a very well worked out story where that comes from," unquote. You bet he doesn't. Fact of the matter is, he's talking through a hole in his professorial hat, and he doesn't have a clue where it might come from. Many years earlier, Bertrand Russell, one of the most colourful British philosophers of the past century, got in the same tangle. He was a passionate atheist, and yet he was an outspoken critic of what he saw as social evils. And when he thought it through, he admitted that he found his own views incredible. So he's a passionate atheist, doesn't accept a biblical view of morality, inveighs against these social evils, and then thinks it through and says, that's an incredible situation to take. And then added, I don't know the solution. So one of the most colourful, articulate, influential thinkers of the past century says that with God out of the picture, he hasn't the slightest explanation for morality. So atheistic evolution is clearly not the answer. Michael Roos, quoted him earlier, said, morality is a creation of the genes. It has the same status as such things as teeth and eyes and noses. It's just something that's developed in the course of evolution over the millennia. But then if that's so, we have no option but to do what our genes have programmed us to do. And if we're programmed to behave in a certain way, we're programmed to do it, then we have no moral choices. And if we have no moral choices, then it's impossible and a nonsense to say that anything we do is right or wrong, good or bad. Here is Steve Jones, who lectures in genetics at the University of London, and another passionate atheism. Steve Jones says that creationism is, you ready for this? Pure poison. But it's godless evolutionism that is poisonous and prepares the way for complete moral degradation. The American serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, who raped, murdered, and ate the body parts of 17 victims, said in prison, when he was asked why he did what he did, said this, and I quote, "Because I believed I came from slime through evolution, and that I was free to do anything I chose as long as I could get away with it," unquote. Now, I'm not saying that if you're an atheistic evolutionist, you're pre-programmed to murder and cannibalism. I'm saying that evolutionism paves the way for even the worst kind of depravity. If we are no more than bags of biological elements governed by the laws of physics, then we have no moral obligations to anybody or anything. And words like right and wrong, good and bad, fair and unfair, just and unjust are merely words with no significance or relevance. Can anybody honestly live with that philosophy? Here is a contemporary scientist, Rodney Holder. If we are nothing but atoms and molecules organized in a particular way through the chance processes of evolution, then love, beauty, good and evil, free will, reason itself, indeed, all that makes us human and raises us above the rest of the created order, lose their objectivity. Why should I love my neighbor or go out of my way to help him? Rather, why should I not get everything I can for myself, trampling on whoever gets in my way? Unquote. And here is Dawkins again, writing in The Independent and being forced to agree. Universal love and the welfare of the species simply do not make evolutionary sense. Nature, he says, is not on our side. And here's another thing. If we are nothing more than gene machines and the survival of the fittest is the great ultimate mark of progress, why bother with those who are apparently not going to make any progress? Now, this is desperately serious. If the survival of the fittest, that's the big thing. That's the motor, if you like, of evolution, or one of the things that drives it along. Then surely the non-survival of the non-fittest is the flip side of the same coin, and therefore worth pursuing. Why should we care for the senile, the chronically sick, the starving, the emotionally subnormal, those with hereditary defects? Surely the simplest and least expensive way is to get shot of them as quickly as possible, and in fact it would be our duty to do so for the benefit of the ongoing human race. Can you seriously go along with that? As a basis for morality, nature is a non-starter. Well, secondly, does it come from within us, from our own personal judgment? Now, the big word here is relativism, one of the defining philosophies of our day. In his important book, The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom says this: there is one thing a professor can be certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. The Manic Street Preachers have a song that says, "This is my truth, now tell me yours." In a nutshell, relativism says that there are no transcendent standards. Everybody's free to do their own. Paul Kurtz, a well-known humanist, the moral principles that govern our behavior are rooted in habit and custom, feeling and fashion. I have a book called, my biggest book is called Does God Believe in Atheists? We're not going to mention it anymore in this session because, believe it or not, we've got people on the way to the airport to get the newest copies and bring them here in time for this afternoon. I call it the Sinatra syndrome. There's a program in England called, been going on since Julius Caesar invaded, called Desert Island Discs. And so some person's asked to come along and interviewed about their life and choose certain records to play. I think it's about 8 in the course of the program. And there is one song that is banned from Desert Island Discs, and it's Frank Sinatra's My Way. And the reason it's banned is everybody was choosing it. Or at least a vast number were. And you can understand why, because that's where we are. What would be one of my favorite songs? I did it my way. That's how self-centered we all are. Richard Rorty, one of the most articulate relativists around, there is nothing deep down inside us except what we have put there ourselves. No criterion that we have not created. In other words, we can make up our own rules. And if we make up our own rules, nobody can say that we're wrong in saying that such and such a thing is right. Let me give you 4 striking examples. The American author Ernest Hemingway said this: what is moral is what you feel good after. What is immoral is what you feel bad after. So there's no ultimate reference point. What's moral is what you feel good after. What's immoral is what you feel bad after. Now imagine this. Here's an old lady walking unprotected along the road. She's mugged by 3 teenagers. They open her purse, grab some money, go to their drug dealer, get a fix, and they feel happy. They feel happy to find the lady, happy to find the money, happy to find the dealer, happy to get the drugs. Here is his dictum. What is moral is what you feel good after. Well, they feel good. So that's moral? Nobody here would agree with that. Hugh Hefner was the founder of the Playboy empire and the so-called Peter Pan of soft porn. He brags of having slept with over 1,000 women. He told London's Daily Telegraph, "I'm a pretty ethical guy. Moderation is the key." Well, to say that Hefner has the alleys of a moral cat is probably to slander alley cats. But look, if we are free to choose our own morality, none of us has the right to say that Hefner was wrong. Adolf Hitler, when he set about building his infamous Third Reich, slaughtered 6 million Jews, 1/3 of the Jews in the world. At one point, Jews were being gassed in Auschwitz at the rate of 12,000 a day, 4 times the number of those who died on 9/11. And Hitler thought it was a good thing to do. It would benefit Germany, Europe, the whole world with a new, clean Aryan race. And the 9/11 terrorists. They were convinced they were doing something so noble, so worthy, so honoring to Allah. It guaranteed them a place in heaven with the fringe benefit of 70 virgins apiece. We could discuss that. If we privatize morality, everybody is entitled to set their own moral standards. And who can say that they're mistaken or wrong? But we instinctively know that relativism won't work. We know that child abuse is wrong. Racism is wrong. Not relatively, but absolutely, for everyone at all times, and they're not matters of opinion. R.C. Sproul puts it like this: if I don't like you and decide to murder you, is that good or bad? Well, neither. Or both. It's relative, especially for your relatives. It may be considered bad, but for me it's good since I've destroyed a personal enemy. So in a relativistic court of law, why should a judge find against me? You see, the Sinatra syndrome, well, I'll do it my way, sounds adult and exciting, but ultimately it leads to the kind of chaos that nobody can handle. Peter Atkins says that humanity is just a bit of slime on a planet. I don't know if that's what he calls his wife, but that's his problem and not mine. But if he's right, you and I are free from any moral obligation. And to some people, that may sound like good news. I'm free from any moral obligation. I can do my own thing. Here's the bad side. Everybody else can do their own thing. And if doing their own thing hurts you, tough. Because that's the philosophy that you've embraced. Well, does it come from around us, from society, from the prevailing culture? Well, that won't work either because cultures change. And it's difficult to take your standard from someone else. How can we be sure that public opinion is any better than private opinion? What if the voting suddenly goes the other way? Then what we thought was wrong was right, and what we thought was right is wrong. And which culture shall we choose? In 1995, the authorities in Tehran decided that minibuses in the city should be segregated to stop male and female passengers brushing against each other, because that was a sin to Islamic law. And a transport official calculated that as 370,000 females a day were brushed against, 10 times each, 3.7 million sins were being committed every day on the bus system, and that had to be stopped. Well, the statistics may have been accurate, but the moral judgment right? And cultures change, sometimes dramatically. Present-day Germany doesn't accept Nazism. And some of the most honored people in history are those who've not gone along with the culture of their times, but fought tooth and nail against it until radical changes were made. The abolition of slavery would be one. Cultural morality is riddled with relativism. So how can it be an absolute guide for morality if there's no transcendent moral point? I love the story of a man who on his way to work every day was seen to stop outside a clockmaker's shop, twiddle with his watch, and then make his way to work. The owner saw him do this every day, 5 days a week. And his curiosity got the better of him, and eventually said, I've got to find out what this guy's doing. So he stopped and said, I won't keep you, but I've noticed you come down every day and do this. What's your job? He said, I'm the timekeeper at the local factory. And I blow a whistle when it's a tea break or a coffee break or a lunch break or changing shifts. And at 5 p.m, I sound a great big hooter. You must be able to hear it all over the town. Tells everybody it's time to knock off and go home. Trouble is, my watch doesn't keep very good time. So every morning on the way to work, I come down, see that massive clock face? I just adjust my watch to fit in with that clock face. And the shopkeeper said, well, thank you for telling me that. And I hardly know how to tell you this, but my clock doesn't keep very good time. But I do synchronize it every afternoon when I hear the hooter go from the factory. So it's no good us saying, well, we get our morality from out there. Doesn't come from beneath, doesn't come from within, doesn't come from without. Clearly, it has only one other possible source, and that is from above. And 4 things would need to be true about this source of morality. It would have to be transcendent, over and above and beyond and other than us. Secondly, it would have to be perfect. Can't have the goalposts being moved. Then it would have to be unchanging. And it would also have to be personal, because obligations are to a person and not to things. And the God of whom we read in Scripture meets all the criteria. He is transcendent. He is the uncreated creator of all reality outside of himself. Secondly, he is perfect. We can read through Scripture. He is perfect in beauty. His works are perfect. His way is perfect. He's perfect in knowledge. The law of the Lord is perfect. He is majestic in holiness. And as C.S. Lewis brilliantly puts it, a man can no more diminish God's glory than a lunatic can put out the sun by scribbling the word darkness on the doors of his cell. This explains why we can make sound moral decisions. We are created by a moral God and given moral guidelines. Thirdly, he is unchanging. I am the Lord, I do not change. God is utterly unchangeable in his being, his wisdom, his power, his holiness, his justice, his goodness, and his truth. And he is personal. He is not cosmic dust or atmospheric energy. He's not an it or a thing. He's dynamically alive. He thinks. He chooses. He cares. He gives. He makes and keeps promises. Can we be good without God? Can we make sense of morals and ethics unless we have a biblical worldview? And for reasons that have taken me this hour to unpack, the answer can be given in one syllable: no. Without a compass, there's no way to distinguish between north and south. Without God, there's no way to distinguish between right and wrong.